So just to remind you, this is the final webinar of 5 that we've organized in the last 4 weeks. We started on the 26th of September. And yes, and today's session will actually be is scheduled for 1.5 hours. So for those who've joined us, you can introduce yourselves in the chat. And okay, I see we're stabilizing in terms of the number of people joining. All right, let's just get started then. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. So welcome to this 5th webinar in the series, From Silos to Systems, where I just mentioned we started this series back in on the 26th of September, 4 weeks ago, and today we've reached our final webinar of this series, which is organized by the Commonwealth Secretariat in collaboration with the Digital Agri Hub, hosted by the University of Wageningen. And this is organized in collaboration with our partners, AGRA, Farmerline, and the GIZ DIASCA program. And DIASCA stands for Digital Integration of Agri-Supply Chains Alliance. And as you may have joined us in the past, we've got obviously a good lineup of speakers and panelists today, and I'll go through it in a moment, but maybe just to remind you of a few background etiquette. Obviously, if you have your video on, we welcome you to have your video on. The microphone is usually muted at the moment, but we will allow you to unmute your microphones during the question and answer sessions. And if at any time you have any burning questions, please use the reactions to raise your hand, and we'll be able to give you the floor. So just to remind you, we started again, as I said, five webinars ago, where we talked about the concept of DPI. We went through some of the definitions of DPI according to the World Bank. We looked at this latest report that was looking at how does DPI apply in the agricultural sector, a report that was released just about a month ago. And this is what we saw in the report, the fact that we are going from traditional siloed systems that are then, if you use the concept of digital public infrastructure, you're able to connect a lot more services and provide even more services based on that infrastructure. And what we had yesterday was the launch of the policy guide on the national agricultural data infrastructure. Again, that was this is in fact the culmination of 3 years of work intermittently, conceptualizing, doing the validation workshops through national dialogues in four countries, and working through the champions from these countries through a write shop to come up with this policy guide that was released yesterday, and which is now downloadable online. So just to remind you, we had a quick preview of this, the contents of the guide 2 weeks ago, when Ben talked about this analogy of a road infrastructure to explain the concept of NAgDI, which we propose should be looked at from 4 components perspective: technologies and systems, policies and principles, governance and administration, marketing and business model. And obviously, we differentiate between the different types of data that are maintained, that are on these different systems, and how NAgDI is an approach to the delivery of DPIs, but NAgDI itself is not a DPI. but these two are very much related. So again, to reflect what I just said, the vision of NAgDI is that it's here to harmonize and connect existing data infrastructure within the country, such that you are able to have data exchange amongst the different institutions or different systems that are existing within the agricultural system, but at the same time allowing these NAgDI, these infrastructures at national level to be connected with other countries, and eventually then supporting decision-making at regional level, trade and business of agricultural products across the region. So, in other words, trade in the region. So the policy guide then describes in more detail going from the vision to the different goals, and what is also presented in the policy guide is this this diagram that presents NAgDI in the form of an investment project that a government or any sort of a ministry of agriculture can present to the policymakers in terms of seeking support to be able to establish NAgDI. Now, NAgDI is not just for the public sector, but it is also for the private sector. So again, these four different components talk about how you initiate in general with a kind of a strong governmental push to initiate the process, but eventually trying to identify an independent governance model, including both public and private sector parties. So the policy guide also then talks about how this investment program can be scheduled in the form of a project, but with activities ranging over what we've referred to as a figurative 5-year implementation period. So obviously, if you're quite advanced in terms of the technologies and systems in a country, it could take you less time. But the key message here is that the NAgDI is an approach that, to delivery of DPIs and other services in the agricultural sector. And it's not something that can happen immediately with just the implementation of technology, but it requires efforts on advocacy, the policies, regulations, and so on. So more details in the policy guide, which again, I said, you can download, and you can see on the graphic there how the activities that have been identified as requiring consideration in the implementation of DPI can happen or need to happen at different times in that implementation period. Just again, so in that graph, there were about 64 detailed activities that have been identified, which we think, or which we hope, will help a country using those detailed activities plan the implementation of NAgDI in their country. So for today, we have 4 speakers. One of them is not with us, but lined up for the presentations today. And the theme for today, at the end of the series, is more to talk about the potential for collaboration. Obviously, there's a lot of, let's say, competition amongst different interventions, whether it is donor programs, whether it is interventions, whether it is projects, and so on. But we are looking at what are the ways to promote collaboration, and the term co-petition is one that comes up very often as a model for competitors to get together and collaborate where there's a mutual benefit. And so to start off this series or this panel discussion, sort of seasoned with a little bit of presentations from our speakers, we'll start off with Venki Ramachandran, who is the founder of Agribusiness Matters, and Bharat Ganapati, who's Senior Program Manager at the FIDE, which is the Foundation for Interoperability in Digital Economy, which is the name for what used to be called the Beacon Foundation. In fact, a lot of conversations are going to be around this backend protocol. So Venki, I'll hand over to you to get us started, and just to introduce this whole concept of co-petition, and Bharat can step in for the sections on the backend protocol. Over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Krishan, and thank you for inviting us. This is going to be a sort of a very different approach to sort of introducing the idea of co-petition. Typically, I thought of, instead of starting from a place of exploring technology and all of those, I thought, why not start from ground data? But if you could just go to the next slide. So this is, I wanted to start from a historical data to show that some of these concepts are not new concepts. So this is the data of a survey that was done in the southern parts of India between the 1760s to 1770s. I'm not going to go into way too detail into this data. This was collected by the British government before they left India. So this is way back in 1760s when they were sort of collecting data on India. This was much longer, older data here. What is interesting in this is that they have actually done sort of calculations on how the village agricultural produce will be distributed for each of the village level institutions. So on the left you see these the various levels of village institutions, and on the right you see how the agricultural produce would be distributed. If you could go to the next slide. So the CMP are sort of the ways in which each of the districts and the regions and based on the infrastructure and how the proportions in which, based on each season wise, how they would be distributed. The reason why I'm bringing this data is to sort of give a sense of Bharat, is there a way I can get access to the presentation? Yeah, I can go more to the next slide. Yeah. So the reason why I'm bringing this aspect here and the data is actually to kind of reflect on the fact that it's not necessarily that these are sort of current ideas. These have been ideas that have existed for a very long time, and now we have a better infrastructure through technology that can also make some of these co-petition models. And because of what we are seeing here in the past data is also that villages have ensured that certain levels of infrastructure are available for the co-petition to happen. And that is what we still need to build in. And I'm hoping that activities and initiatives like NAgDI could also further activate. Right? Now, to come to the main subject, when we talk about enabling co-petition, there are pretty much two ways in which you go about it, right? If I work in the domain of agribusiness, and there typically the one way in which co-petition happens is by the associations that are formed, consortiums that are made. Like today, the leading companies in, say, irrigation or solar or the global crop protection companies, each of them have developed their own set of consortiums and associations that helps them to come together as a collective and as a cooperative. The reason I've used these graphics here is oftentimes we tend to confuse each of these parts in terms of what is a collectivity, what is a collaborative. What you can see here is, while these initial methods and modes of enabling co-petition are collective and cooperative means, but they don't enable a collaborative forms of organizing. And that's where we move to the next one. We could go to the next slide. And that's where we move to the second part. That's where the ecosystem comes. No, the previous one. Yeah. So and that's where we move to the aspect of building ecosystems. Ecosystems are largely that enable all three forms of organizing: what is a collective form, what is a cooperative form, and the collaborative form. I'm sure if you see the graphics, you'll be able to understand the subtle differences in what it takes to move from a collective to a cooperative to collaborative, right? I want to emphasize on these nuances here because we often tend to conflate all the three, but I want to pay attention to this. Now, again, these models are not just in the theoretical models. We have companies that have attempted this. Go to the next slide, please. So we have people like D. Hawk. D. Hawk was a very interesting person who brought the Visa network to life, which was a very real company that brought the ideas of co-opetition at a massive scale. Right? Today, we take our financial, if you look at the inefficiencies of credit card system back in the 60s, they didn't have the kind of flexibility that we have today. Right? So, they didn't have a centralized clearing mechanisms. There was a lot of chaos in the 60s when the American credit card industry went through a lot of trouble. So he envisaged a sort of a new form of organization that is very self-organizing and can enable people to come together in own terms and also compete in own terms and collaborate in own terms. And that's where the word chaotic comes. It's a chaos and order together, right? There is chaos in terms of how it is managed, chaos in terms of how different players come together. And there is order in the underlying structures in which you bring them together. So he formed the National Bank America card, which later became Visa. And then he also, of course, got sure that the regulatory approval is in place. So this we are talking about real live companies that have scaled these approaches and make sure that they are able to enable co-opetition at a massive levels of scale here, right? If we go to the next slide. So in this, again, what he built out is he built a cloud level of infrastructure that enabled the level of national telecom network to be formed. And he created this new entity called Visa that was formed from the Americard, which sort of brought together all the players at a global level. And then, of course, he had much bigger ideas than that. He came up with a complete operational model. This is a very good book called The Birth of Chaotic Age. If anyone is very keen to look at this aspect of co-opetition at a very deeper level here. Of course, we also had other companies in the other parts of the world that have also attempted this. If you go to the next slide. We had companies like Hire, which integrated Chinese models of co-opetition. Now they brought in aspects from Chinese culture, which talked about self-organizing, and then they created models where hierarchies are eliminated, because one way to enable co-opetition is to remove hierarchies, right, and thereby create a flat structures which works on sort of a zero distance model where you bring the employee and the customer together and create a self-organizing entity. If you could go to the next slide. So this is the self-organizing entity model, that what you call as a node MEs. These units typically are smaller clusters that bring together a group of 10 employees, and then they create the structures in a way where they form a larger clusters, and each of these clusters intersect with large companies. Today, Hire, they acquired GE Appliances, they acquired Sanyo in Japan, and right now it's more than a $200 billion worth firm. So they have been able to scale these approaches at scale. So the reason why I'm giving you a theoretical background is to actually get into the question of how do we do this in agriculture, right? If you go to the next slide. So here, what we attempted, this is not a theoretical aspect here. What we tried to do was, can we build a sort of a structure model where we can bring together different players who offer value products and services to farmers, and then make it community led, right? So that it is rooted in a particular region and it is tied to the needs of a particular farmer from a particular region, and then make it interoperable with different parts of networks. Thereby, it allows it to scale. And then, of course, ensure that it is co-created with the farmers and the service providers. So what we're talking here is essentially not an app or a super app or a platform. We're talking about building an ecosystem here and open network here. So that's what we attempted to do here. I'll come in later on in terms of what did we learn from this experiment. I'll now invite Bharat to go into the furthermore details on beacon protocol and how it actually got built and what is the underlying technical infrastructure here.
Super. Thanks, Venki. Thanks for that intro, and thanks for talking about what UKI as a project started off as. I assume everyone's able to hear me. Let's give me a ping if it's all okay. So what Venki said was especially true in the Indian agriculture sector, right? You have a lot of chaos, and yet there is some amount of order that's emerging out of that chaos. So take, for example, your very, very simple small landowner farmer. That same farmer, that he's a beneficiary for multiple things. A private organization would come to him and say, I have seeds, I have fertilizers, I have pesticides. Why don't you buy them for me? And he would be served by 5 different such organizations. You would also have like a semi-private or a government-supported organization coming and telling him, I have machinery for you at a subsidized rate. Why don't you come and pick it up because I want you to increase yield. You'll have an NGO or a welfare group coming and saying, we have better ways for irrigation. We have better ways for some of the processes that you're following. And you have also, the government itself coming and telling, hey, I understand that you have financial sort of areas that you need support. Why don't you take this particular subsidy? Why don't you take this particular insurance, and so on and so forth, right? So a single beneficiary, and think of this at a scale of the country, which in India is pretty high, and then at the world scale, where every similar looking country will have similar problems, right? Small landowner farmers, you have a lot of things coming together. But for a farmer, the same information, the same identity, the same landowning documentation, the same kind of soil health, all the same information is needed for every single organization, and this whole system becomes very, very untrustworthy if those organizations do not scale well, are not able to sustain those operations well, right? So think about a scenario where a farmer literally needs to get through maybe 20, 25 different players on a regular basis to get just one season of cropping out, right? The idea for us, and this whole idea came together when three participating organizations, FIDE with its program focus of adopting backend protocol. I'll talk about backend protocol next, but a very simple infrastructure based thinking to how we can reimagine this particular sector. You had someone called Spectrum Impact, who's a funding unit, who came together and said, we're really interested in trying to change the way farmers think about their business, because farming ultimately is an economic sort of a pursuit, right? They're taking the welfare out of it. It's an economy. And then you have Indigram Labs Foundation, who were the on-ground sort of organization to actually execute all these ideas. So these three organizations came together and said, can we bring together all of the major guys who are serving a small area called Nashik in the state of Maharashtra in India, which holds about 1 crore or about 10 million farmers, right? And we didn't even reach that level. We said, how do we start at a point where we're able to really factor in and get the impact out of this particular idea? Now, what we did was essentially survey those farmers and say, what are the most important pieces that you need to get done with this particular season of your cropping cycle? And they picked maybe the top 8 you see in green, right? They required access to weather forecast. What was available was either poor or late, which is not helpful in their decision making. They wanted access to spray schedules. I have pests now, but what are the kind of things that I need to do to make sure that my crops aren't dying? They need access to or awareness of what schemes are available to them or what subsidies are available to them. They needed access to some equipment, maybe something as simple as sprayers, maybe something as a drone spraying equipment, or maybe just harvesters, to attach to the back of the tractors. They need some financing because it's something that will help them get through this particular season. And then soil testing, because they understanding the soil health will help them understand what inputs to give it to. Obviously, market prices, because what drives the prices is when they will sell or where they will sell, right? So these are kind of the core areas that we talked about, and then we wanted to pick up insurance and inputs and maybe a bit of exports also later on. Market linkages was something that we really wanted to pick up, but it's such a complex sort of a use case in the Indian market that it required a lot more thought, a lot more players involved, and we said, let's park it for now and let's take another crack at it later. So the logos on the right are essentially all the organizations that helped achieve these 8-10 use cases that you're seeing on the left. What we did really was to essentially create a network of all of these organizations while giving the farmers access to it through one single interface, right? A farmer in our particular scenario was looking at a WhatsApp bot. It had some AI, very, very basic generative AI features, but essentially it would say, I'm a farmer in this particular location, I want weather service. This, whatever you're seeing below, is essentially how that network looked, right? You had certain interfaces which the farmer would use to essentially look up what are the various organizations and platforms that are able to provide that piece of information to me or sell that product to me. Now, this was enabled through a single simple language called backend protocol. Now, backend protocol is essentially, you can think of it as a language for systems, right? It is something that drives economic transactions between discovery, ordering, fulfillment, and post-fulfillment. What I mean by that, a farmer wants to buy a particular product, he will go and discover it, through his interface, but that is internally talking to 20 other, organizations that will probably provide it for him. They then will negotiate probably the rates, the terms of order, how do I get it, etc., etc., and then actually contract to purchase it and then make the payment or promise to pay later. And then this organization that sells this particular product to him is able to actually deliver. If it's a physical product, then come and do it in person. Or if it's a service like soil testing, then actually collect a sample, go and test it, and come back and provide him the results. And then the farmer is able to rate or raise a support request or a grievance request, all digitally, right? And all of this is done because there is a protocol or a standard that's available that each platform can implement. Now, you heard Venki talk about chaos and order. The piece in the bottom, in the blue lines, is essentially what creates this order, right? It is an infrastructure, it is already present, it is invisible. All the farmer needs to know is that someone is available to serve my need. How that need is achieved is irrelevant to the farmer. However, the platforms will need this infrastructure to be able to connect to many such organizations which are all talking the same language, right? And hence this whole network of various platforms comes together. I know it's a heavy slide, but think of it like this. A farmer who's sitting in this particular node, let's say, is able to do two kinds of things, right? He is either able to buy things, which is represented at the bottom left here, I mean the bottom side here. Whereas I talked about some of these use cases already, the inputs, machinery, some of the services, advice, the basic kind of information that the farmer needs to make decisions, and then financing, obviously, which is credit, which is either backed or non-collateral, and then grants and all of those, right? But on the other side, the farmer is also able to sell. Farmer is able to obviously sell his product, bio-waste, a lot of the waste that is generated post-harvest, and then in case of climate-oriented organizations, you can probably create a carbon credit product as well. Now, as a single node,
we'll have to wrap up soon. 2 minutes.
Thank you so much. Yeah. So a single node, this is all possible primarily because there exists a common language that all of these pieces are able to connect through. What we essentially did was create layers of support, and some of these we'll be able to send you this content later, but you're able to create a community layer, expand that, create inputs and connections to various other DPIs and DPGs. And then you're essentially working with a lot of participants, helping create use cases and revisualizing what you're trying to do, right? I'll hand it back to Venki. Do you want to take the next slide, Venki?
Sure. Thanks, Bharat. That sets a context here, right? I actually, went through the previous one a little faster, so we can spend a little bit more time in this part because this is the most important one here. We had to unfortunately close the UKI, but the learnings are still what we are right now taking forward here. So I will go into a little more details as to what did we learn from this exercise, right? Essentially, when we are trying to create a ecosystem network here, we have an agri-tech company, we have farmer at the center, and we have also the government as a player, right? Now, in the smallholding context, it's almost extremely difficult to create, if you're going to target smallholding farmers, it's extremely difficult to create without the government also, intervening in, or because the government also giving the right set of leadership support, right, to drive that. That's also another big learning that we had, right? Because essentially, there is a question of what is the skin in the game, right? While we talk about the benefits, but the governments are always always interested in the question of what happens if something goes wrong, right? What happens if farmers complain about certain things? So one of the key learnings for us was also to see in what ways can we orchestrate all of this together. Now, if you see in the center, you will notice that I have actually put together a hierarchy from village, block, district, state. Now, Christian had asked this question: that is it operable at small scale, or has to be an ecosystem approach right from the start, right?
So now let's discuss that later. But maybe
sure.
Just wrap up in 1 minute.
The reason I'm bringing that point is what we see is right now to create a sort of a self-organizing unit. It has to be at the lowest level that is the village, which is what creates the necessary structures. And then it can then further on add on to the layers at the block level, at the district level, and the state level, and can scale it there, right? Now, the other aspect is also that there is oftentimes a conflict of interest for an IT tech company, vis-a-vis their network, vis-a-vis how they can contribute to an open network here. So managing those trade-offs and then making sure that the network is again self-sustainable, right? We did attempt with a grant and a donor kind of model, but what we are now seeing is that self-sustainable model probably could also be a better approach, given that farmers are going to pay for it, and they could pay for it and then see that what is the value here. So I'll stop here. Happy to address any more questions later, or if there is any specific questions here.
Sure. So if there are any questions from anyone, please put it in the chat. But basically what I understand here is like it was more of an ecosystem approach rather than starting small and building up. But you then face the challenge of what do you do if you have to start from scratch? But anyway, this is my first impressions I got from it. But let's take it up as we look at the other examples. So we'll move to our second presenter today, Ronald Rakigumba, who is a PhD candidate from the University of Coventry, but who is now currently doing his field work in Indonesia. So thank you for joining us late in the evening, Ronald. Now,
thanks.
You in our previous conversations, you had talked about the challenges that people face in African countries and commodity value chains when they're faced with regulations, new regulations. So, yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Krishan. And one of those, so it's actually one of the observations that we make in this response to new regulation is actually the chaos that we had from Venki and Bharat. And let me share a bit. So a bit of context, a lot of what, as you touched on it, Krishan, that the regulation did cause a lot of interest around national data systems globally, partly because the value chains that the EU is targeting, the 7 value chains that have to comply with the EU deforestation regulation, are very key export revenue for many countries. You mentioned coffee, palm oil, rubber, and you find that these 7 value chains that are impacted by the EU deforestation regulation are very key commodities. So just to step back, last year in October, I was contracted by UNCDF to study the value proposition of digital technologies for smallholder farmers to comply. And I think the uniqueness is that a lot of studies had focused a lot on how companies can comply with this regulation or how countries can comply. And I think this study was funded by the FAO Investment Center to actually, like we saw in the last slide that Venki was sharing, to look at the perspective from the farmer readiness. And so, in fact, in those early stages, I reached out to the NAgDI team. I interviewed Ben to understand how NAgDI was designed, and that's why now it's coming full circle to kind of share with you what are some of those things we observed. So the team I worked with from UNCDF, there was a gentleman called Francois Coupon, and on the FAO side, Amol from the FAO Investment Center. So one of the things that struck me in the very early beginning of this study was that first of all, there's currently discussion within the EU to extend the deadline from 31st December 2025 to sometime in 2026, partly because many countries are not ready to comply with EUDR. At the same time, there's a new piece of regulation called the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which is broader but affects fewer companies in the sense that you have to have a net turnover of about close to $500 million, and few companies fall in that bracket. So those that fall below that may not have to play by the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence directive for now, but they still would be expected to comply with EUDR. So how does this all relate with NAgDI and data infrastructure? So in the early stages when this regulation came out, a lot of the companies that are importing coffee, rubber, palm oil, cocoa into the EU were thinking of how do they position to comply with this regulation. So the regulation requires that these value chains, these products, are not in a way contributing to deforestation based on a benchmark of 2020, 31st December, right? So one of my observations was that a lot of the data people think about when it comes to like data infrastructure is not actually the data that some of these regulations are also looking at. So for example, one of the key data points is the idea that you must map a farmer to a plot of land. Now, a lot of the markets, you may find, okay, you've profiled farmers and all that, but do you have proof of land ownership? Are you able to tag a particular farmer to a particular plot of land? And that's what I call the missing step 0, is that when we think of NAgDI, when we think of data infrastructure, it's also critical to start to think of what are the necessary data sets, and are they in existence? So in fact, the GSMA, has a study where they say, look, we see exporters running to Latin America because the land registries there are perhaps more ready to just come online. They may be offline, but they exist. And so it may be easier to comply. Other data sets may have to do with identity, having a unique identifier for particular farmers or payments. Now, Venki and Bharat mentioned chaos, and actually in the last 1 year, as many countries are grappling with what to do, because the EU may not be the only market, but they are a significant market. In fact, for coffee, for example, there are statistics that say that 60% of global coffee is bought in the EU. EU companies buying this. So it is a significant market, and it explains why the deadline is being extended. Now, I just mentioned this because when we think of NAgDI, when we think of data infrastructure, what is some of that chaos that we see emerging? So, for example, in Uganda, the approach taken was for about 8 companies that export to the EU, and I think in the case of Uganda, they account for about 83% of the coffee commodity that is exported to the EU. They came together and got a loan of about $15 million and went ahead and profiled close to 2 million coffee farmers in Uganda. And as a result, I think Uganda was one of the first countries to really, even if the deadline stays as it is, 31st December 2025, Uganda will be compliant. Not many markets can say that, partly because Uganda had other pieces that they brought together, like a law passed and financing driven. But in that chaos, you have a government working with private sector, and then you have that as one chaotic model emerging. In Ethiopia, it's not necessarily coffee value chain. In Ethiopia, it's more of identity, where the Ethiopian government opened up to saying, if you are creating identities, we are interested. We can have a mechanism in which you share that data and we validate it, and then we avoid the duplication of having to collect that data. But that's not the only model of government private sector working alongside. What I did come across, for example, in Indonesia, was a private company where if you are buying cocoa in Indonesia and a different private sector company comes to Indonesia to buy cocoa, but maybe even a different value chain, maybe palm oil, but from similar farmers. I think one of the interesting things I saw was the willingness for a company like Coltiva in Indonesia to say, no, look, this farmer has already been profiled by us. We can seek permission from the company that invested in that profiling for us to use that same data for you. So there's that private sector-led model where a company like Cultiva is saying, look, we will not charge another company to collect the same data, we already have it, but we'll seek permission. So another chaotic, in a positive way, chaotic arrangement I saw like in Ghana. So if you look at, while EUDR focuses on deforestation, CS3D is focused on human rights and ecological results. And one of those human rights components is fair wages. So what I saw in Ghana, it was a company called C-Trace, where they are able to verify in a transparent way, and this is available to the public. You can trace palm oil products back to the price that the farmers were paid at. And I think that level of transparency is to respond to CS3D and saying fair wages. So I see that you have this private with private, because C-Trace is not itself needing these products, but C-Trace comes in as a verifier for another company called COA. And so you'd find two private companies coming together to provide the transparency needed by the EU. Tanzania is still in early stages. The Tanzania approach is still what's available publicly is that the government is trying to build a data set of different agricultural practice, of different agricultural data being collected, and with an aspiration that this will be available to the public. So it's almost very close to what NAgDI is imagining, a framework through which different private public stakeholders work together, but it's still in its infancy. And Ben, Christian and I are still reaching out to those working on this project to see how we can share the NAgDI value proposition. Then the last one.
2 minutes, 2 minutes, Ronald, please.
Thanks. So thanks, Christian. So the last one is really farmers. I call it farmers to the world, which is very similar to what has been shared before, around farmers being the ones who are doing their own data collection, and there are many benefits for that. And then they share this data, and the way they do it is they do it through their cooperatives. So the last component I would like to share with you is that not everything is rosy. So a lot of challenges around, even in the case of Uganda, for how current will this data be next year and the year after, considering some farmers will be moving farms and things like that. And we had yesterday at the launch, farmer profiling fatigue, different stakeholders going to the same farmers. And there's a lot I could say about quarter on half chains, but I would rather end with what I feel is the value proposition for NAgDI. I think the incompleteness of datasets stands out because no one, considering the complexity of different regulations, there's no one house that has all the data points. So even within the government, there's this need to speak to different government departments, even beyond agriculture, to comply with the different regulations. And the second last piece I would say is the driving of incentives, that the NAgDI value proposition is that you need to satisfy different stakeholder interests, and having a forum like NAgDI where there is clear reward systems will incentivize different actors to bring in and exchange their data. So lastly, freeing government donor money. I think Verek touched on this, and same as Barrett, that actually a lot of the data collection, a lot of the digital agriculture projects, sadly, are spending more than half their budget in profiling. And I think this has kept digital agriculture in its very basic state. And unfortunately, you find a lot of duplication of this. So I think that having these shared platforms will actually free government, donor, or private sector funds to actually go towards building the use cases that we saw in the previous presentation. So thank you very much. I'll stop at this. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ronald. I think it's interesting because from what I'm thinking through as I'm hearing what all three of you have presented so far, that and I think Ben will agree with me, but we'll get to that later on, that I think these are exactly the reasons why we need something like NAgDI as an approach to delivering DPI, because when you start maybe with the implementation straight away, you realize that in hindsight that you should have started with more planning or should have been sensitization, so there's less resistance to the adoption of the technologies and so on. Yeah, so we had planned to have another speaker. That was Lars Kannert, who is from GIZ, but who was in the launch ceremony yesterday as one of the panelists. So he is an advisor on digitization with GIZ, working on sustainable agricultural supply chains initiative, and also I think involved in the DIASCA program. So since he's not with us and he had to catch the plane today to go back, I just wanted to share that yesterday he gave examples of several initiatives that the GIZ was involved in and involved with different partners in different parts of the world doing different things. And one of the questions that I kept in mind was, so how is GIZ making sense of all the things it's doing with different partners? And again, the big question is, can something like the NAgDI approach provide a frame for us to make sense of all these kinds of interventions? So now we'll get to our last presenter in a moment, but looking at the numerous challenges or the attempts that have been done and the kind of, I would not say speed bumps that we're having in moving forward. So our next panelist is Stuart Collis, who is Senior Program Officer for Digital Agriculture Solutions at the Gates Foundation. And now his work is also around digital farmer services, smart farming, digital agriculture ecosystem. So not even agricultural ecosystems, but digital agriculture ecosystems. So Stuart, I've heard of the good work that the Gates Foundation has been doing over the past years, and I remembered, I was impressed when I read about something back in 2017 where I saw that the foundation had supported an open source software platform to allow different mobile operators to connect their payment systems, and that it was prototyped, for example, in Tanzania, and I just looked it up today. It's called Moja Loop, which I think is still being used. Now, your foundation is known for doing the horizon scanning, looking at what are the challenges beyond the horizon, what are the potential solutions to deal with this. And at the moment, you've heard a lot about NAgDI. You've interacted with Ben and I before, and the kind of the flavor of the month nowadays is, what do we do about AI? And I understand your foundation is also looking at what are the potential uses of AI for farmer advisory services. So perhaps maybe you can, having heard all the things that were said before, maybe tell us a bit about what the foundation is doing at the moment or is supporting, and how do you see a role for NAgDI to come into this ecosystem and try to provide some sense-making options? Over to you, Stuart.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, and thanks for asking for me to participate here. I just want to check, can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, before I dive into the specific area I focus on, I thought today might be useful to just touch on a specific use case and how we're leveraging DPI for that application. Because it gets so sort of hard to grapple with all the applications that could potentially apply and the use cases in agriculture when you think about some of these building blocks. Before I dive into that, though, you're correct. The Gates Foundation has invested for some time in some of the foundational DPI assets that are out there. Moja Loop is one of them. There's also a program called MOSIP, which is the national ID. Open source national ID platform. That's a really great story because it was based on the ADHA architecture that was built in India. That now you have over 1 billion people using that system, and that really is the underpinning for lots of things like payments and access to government services, DPT and so forth. And so the MOSIP platform was and still is being deployed in many other countries. I think it's up to about 25 countries now that MOSIP has been deployed. And I think the important distinction here is it's just a good example of where, when it comes to sort of these types of digital platforms, there can be a mix of private sector proprietary systems and open source systems, DPI approaches where you're really more working on the protocol as opposed to the data architecture or the service delivery. It's a good example where, I think previous to something like MOSIP, you would often have a tender put out for a national ID system, but that could potentially lock a country into a single service provider. And so something like a DPI asset here is a layer to enable countries to basically swap out different providers, especially on the biometric side of things. That can be really helpful for keeping costs low, transparency around how the system operates, and put the government in the driver's seat on who they end up working with, and not get locked into proprietary systems. And so that's just, I think, one of the principles in the DPI approach is, it's really, if you talk to Pramod Varma, who's one of the sort of key architects of the EUDR system and MOSIP and the DPI movement, is to say it's not necessarily one specific solution. It's not public or private. It's really more about protocol-based approach or a DPI approach to solving a problem. And DPI may not be the answer in every situation. So I think in agriculture, we've got an interesting situation where you want some public goods available, and you want some sort of situations where you maybe don't want sort of monopolistic lock-in, but you also want a competitive market. So you want private sector players participating in the design of these systems. So anyway, I'll dive into just a little bit on our specific use case that we're focusing on here on AI, because what's interesting about AI, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this, every time you talk about AI and everybody's excited about the opportunities here, it often comes down to a data discussion. And I think that's where NAgDI can really help sort of surface some of these issues around, okay, if you're going to use AI, if you're going to sort of reap the benefits of these new technologies, you need access to data. These models work on more data. The more data, the better for training these models. And so if we don't have access to that data, then we're going to be limited, hands, one hand tied behind your back, sort of thing. So just as an illustrative example, on the artificial intelligence side, what I'm really focusing on is extension and advisory systems. So, we heard about many other use cases there earlier on finance and payments and, market access tools, traceability. There's many places, both DPI and NAgDI can play a role. But in the extension and advisory side, what we're addressing is just the lack of access to extension for farmers. Most farmers don't see an extension agent. They don't have access to the content they need, the information they need. We've seen some good results so far with, very basic, I would say, ICT type services where you're sending a text message once a week, or you might have an IVR system that a farmer can call into to get some general information. But one of the challenges is that your farmers might get general information, but it's not tailored to them specifically. And so, if you think about this scenario where a farmer calls a short code, say in Ethiopia, it's 8028, they get a sort of menu list of options to sort of get some information about wheat farming or, sorghum or some wheat rust disease. But it's not tailored to their specific location. So, okay, how would you do that? You'd have to have that phone number associated with a person, associated with a ID, with a location for that farm field, so that you could then tap into a wheat rust model or a weather forecast for that specific place. So, this is sort of where the DPI components come in. In order to reach scale and tailor things to individual farmers, you need these foundational assets. And so, you've got to keep costs low as well. I think one of the challenges we've seen in the digital agriculture space is there's many ag tech companies out there, There's, I think in Sub-Saharan Africa, latest count around 750 ag tech companies. There's been about $1.5 billion raised collectively by those companies over the last 10 years. Yet in many countries, we still only see 10% adoption of those services. So clearly we have an issue. One, I think, is certainly on the digital literacy, language literacy side, but the other is the foundational building blocks are not there for ag tech companies to build on. They have to do all of this themselves. You heard the example earlier where you've got, let's say in Kenya, you've got 100 companies. They're all going around collecting farmer data repeatedly of the same farms. So this seems like an ideal opportunity for something like a data exchange. But if we think about AI, I mean, we've got language models, we've got voice interfaces, you've got multimodal capability, video generation. I won't spend too much time on this. This is sort of, I think everybody's heard about the potential of AI and how it can transform access to information and decision-making on a farm level. So we're quite excited about that. But in order for that to work, you've got to have this infrastructure sitting behind it. And so this is sort of a generalized view of the types of users, farmers, investors, producers, agribusinesses, governments, could be agri dealers, could be extension agents as well. In terms of the building blocks you need, you're going to have some of these digital agriculture user interface applications, and then below that, sector-specific building blocks. So that gets into your farmer registries, your soil maps, your livestock registries, list of approved pesticides, or varietal performance information. So a lot of information that's relevant to agriculture. Some of it's just data, but some of it's also going to be things like farmer profiles, which have a specific schema, and you want to have that schema shared amongst many actors if you're going to collectively leverage that across the sector. And then the foundational building blocks are those cross-domain areas. So that's your ID, that's your general digital public infrastructure, and then your actual internet and mobile coverage and things like that. I won't spend too much time on this, but just to say that we have a report, and I'll mention in a moment, that we just launched with Co-Develop, breaking down all these different elements of where DPI shows up and data sharing shows up across the agricultural sector. But just to get specific on the AI advisory side, if you're thinking about delivering AI advisory to all these actors, and you have these delivery channels, voice interfaces, apps, messaging platforms, dashboards, you sort of build an AI-driven advisory service. You're going to need things like benchmarking and corpus development for AI. And you're going to need this agri-stack. So the farmer registries, the livestock registries, you're going to need protocols for that. In the future, as we get into this world where we've got agentic AI systems, reaching out to different services, you need API access to those. So you need API access to an input ordering or a financial product, or, to connect to markets or to get market price information. And then all the things, a lot of these have been mentioned earlier, is just those foundational data layers on soil maps, weather, pest and disease alerts, and so forth. And then your foundational layers. Now, not all of these require DPI. Some of these require sort of a DPI approach. Some of them are just simply good, sort of API access to data, and having a sort of all of this accessible and open as possible. Just to note in closing that we have a project called Open AgriNet, and that's really focusing on what are those protocols for stitching together different data sets for the purposes in this specific example on AI advisory. So how do you make sure you've got that corpus available, not to bring it all into one centralized place, but think about it as a federated system where data sits where it should sit, and where people who own it are updating it and curating it, but you're able to bring it together for the purposes of delivering more precise, tailored advice to smallholder farmers. And then just finally, the report I mentioned, that's up on the Co-Develop website, so you can go to codevelop.fund. This was co-funded by Gates Foundation and the World Bank, working with co-developed Vital Way of an Open Agronet. And Ben was interviewed as part of this. I think we've got some quotes in there from you, Ben, in this report. But it's just laying out, there's a whole bunch of things going on in this space, and some of it's public sector oriented, some private sector oriented. But it remains to be seen as to how countries will adopt DPI and NAgDI approaches. Some will lean more into private sector solutions and cloud providers. Some will have their own hosting environments and totally open DPI, open source approaches. But I don't think there's any one specific approach that. I think the important thing is that we unlock access to this data to enable these AI solutions to work. There's a global DPI summit coming up in Cape Town. Hopefully some of you will be there. We'll be hosting a panel on this topic with a few government partners and some private sector players. So over, thank you.
Great, thank you, Stuart. In fact, we did feature the report by co-developed Vital Wave, and we had someone from the World Bank in our first webinar. It was Nidhi Parekh who actually presented the definition of DPI from the World Bank's perspective, and then the perspective and the diagrams that you had shown from the report. Yeah, so it's okay. I had asked people to put in their questions in the chat, but maybe Ben, since I can put you on the spot today, since yesterday you put me on the spot, to sort of having heard all these things, what was said, and Stuart's comments about the process and the looking forward bit. What comes to your mind now in terms of where did you see NAgDI being able to respond to all these different challenges that people mentioned?
Yeah, no, thanks. And thanks to all the speakers. I wanted to just make a comment on the EUDR because, in fact, I was with Lars before he went to the airport. So I was asking him about, these regulations and the negative implications, policy implications for our countries. So I asked him, and he himself he's working on it. So he said, look, now EU is struggling to even manage the data that people are uploading into the system that they have created. You can imagine even one polygon, the number of data points, and each of those data points of the polygon has both longitude and latitude and all kinds of, so they are struggling with the data that, partners are uploading into the system. So it's a lot of problem. So we need to find a way, so now they are coming out with a way where, an identity, an ID is created for one polygon. So you don't need all those data. Once you scan the QR code, the ID will be accepted. But unfortunately, the regulation doesn't allow that. So they have to go back and see how to cope with that. So yeah, so that's the EUDR that Ronald talked about. From Ronald to Venki and Bharat, I think we need to go back to the practical case. How do we do it? And that's why I like what Ronald talked about, the Ugandan case. How did it happen? These partners, what did they do? Did they start with everybody? Did they start small? I like the concept, the explanation presented by Venki, the thinking, and how do we move from that step by step all the way to the collaborative, stage. And when it comes to the agricultural data, how do we do it? And from what Stuart said, is all these boil down to that data. And the data is all there. It's not that we don't have the data. The data is all there. How do we ensure access? The only issue I have with okay, I don't want to say I have issue with, but the open agreement, open agreement, you know, I had conversation with them before, is, you know, it's like a marketplace. That was my understanding at the time. But where do we bring in the farmer or the user ID? You know, how do we protect that? To create that, you know, I don't know whether it's only open agreement or also beacon protocol, where you create that marketplace that allows, you know, services to be discovered. I think it's beacon protocol. I don't know whether open agreement also has that idea, but how do we bring that, you know, user ID that needs to be protected? And, you know, so I think the discussion now, I just want to leave it open, the practical case, because NAgDI, as we are saying, after the launch of the guide now, we are going to go to countries, beginning with Malawi the first week of December, to start the conversation. How do we actually get people to start this collaboration with their data? You know, they have the data. I was in Bangalore a few weeks ago, and I'm talking on open, you know, network now, so I have to be careful. And I had a good conversation with one of the tech providers, and his concern was that, look, we have built a data exchange platform, but because people who claim they have the data, unfortunately, the quality of data that they have is not allowing them to get exposed to the exchange platform. Because when the data comes in, then things will be discovered. Now, look, the data you have is not correct, you know, and then people will be in trouble. So that is the other thing, you know, when the exchange comes in, how do we get, what is the incentive? How do we bring people in to be willing to exchange their data? So I'll leave it to all of you as we spend the next few minutes to think together for the next steps.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. It's good to give us food for thought, and I'll just throw in a few questions as well that we can reflect on. So it seems that we I lost my train of thought here. You know, I was going back to one of the diagrams that Stuart had shown, the building blocks. So we talk a lot about the foundational DPI, and so connectivity or ICT infrastructure, then the DPI infrastructure, then we talk about the building blocks, and as we go higher, we get closer to what they call the service facing or the customer facing services. Now, and so the conversation also seems to be that maybe you cannot start small, or you cannot start with implementation without the stakeholders understanding what is the pathway to realization in the long run. And is it that we are all failing to have the bigger picture in mind, that we're allowing our stakeholders to become impatient before we conclude our intervention? Or is it that we need to spend more time thinking theoretically about how do we go about doing it? Because it's actually a change process that we're trying to bring into this ecosystem here, into the agricultural ecosystem, but in terms of the human and institutions and the data management. So is it more of a social change process rather than the technology introduction process that we're looking at? And that might even then be the answer to what Stuart was saying, is that yes, AI is fine, but if you don't have the data to support it or to train AI, you will not get very far. So I'm just downloading my thoughts to everyone else, and those who are listening to us, please, type in your questions or your thoughts or come in, because this is our chance to now decide how do we now move forward with all these interesting things we've heard over the last 5 webinars, including in the e-conversations we've had over the last month. The different interventions. So one of the big questions I have is, where are these experiences being documented? Are we just going to conferences and presenting it, or is there a way we should be documenting it so that others can learn from our various experiences? This is me as a knowledge management person thinking that, yes, I cannot spend my time in webinars hearing all these nice stories and then the challenges without finding the source where I can learn from. So that is my next big question for everyone. Why do you find out more about these different experiences? How can we bring people who have similar experiences to come together, even virtually, to be able to then build up on what are the promising practices and how do we now build that into good practices that we can generalize? Over to you. Stuart, you put your hands up first. Go ahead.
Yeah, please.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's a great conversation because it can become very hard to grapple with all these complex data sets, and I think maybe breaking it down into it is sort of a bit of a chicken and egg, because you on one hand you want to focus on a very specific use case because that's where the value is. Like the reason ID has been so successful, I think, is really because it drives payments. That's really there's a financial incentive there for people to participate, for governments to figure this out, and so individual ID, verification of a person is just so fundamental to a lot of things, but payments and access to government services are so important that's prioritized. In agriculture, there's just many similar use cases, and when you focus on one specific use case, though, the challenge is that it's hard to think about. It's hard to abstract up to think about. Okay, if I'm going to build, let's say, and we've seen this actually, we've seen many databases built of farmer registries for subsidy programs, let's say. So, okay, a government builds a national farmer registry for subsidy programs. And then, okay, that works for the subsidy program, but then you try to apply that for market access or for advisory. It's like, oh, we didn't collect that information as part of the first, you weren't thinking about these other use cases. And so, and then you've got to redo the whole effort. But maybe it's a stepwise approach to this. You sort of tackle some of the use cases, you try to abstract up as much as you possibly can. My background's in software development, and that's what software developers are always trying to do. If you build a solution that's so tailored to a specific user, you'll build something that nobody else can utilize. You're always trying to abstract up as much as you can. But the problem with that is sometimes you get too abstract and too disconnected from the actual use case, and you build something that's nobody wants to use. So I think it's like this sort of iterative process, and I think having a forum for countries and for implementers, I think bringing in people that have built these things before. For example, in Ethiopia, we're funding some work on the National Farmer Registry, and we're bringing in the experts from India that help build the AgriStack there, so that we can reuse some of those assets, reuse some of the ideas and the thinking on farmer profiles, crop registry, and so forth. And I think, to your point on data marketplaces, Ben, I think also you got to differentiate between what's PII, like what's foundational, where does government really need to play a stronger role? What's protected by consumer protection laws and data protection laws, and then where do you want a more open marketplace where you have a data exchange where different actors, input suppliers, off takers, financial services are sharing farmer data because that's just more efficient. So I think we've got to differentiate between those different aspects and roles.
Yeah. I was just thinking about as you were talking, Stuart. So what is the challenge in terms of learning from others' experience? Is it that people are too eager to show and demonstrate and say, okay, you'll understand what it is about by just showing you something that has worked? Or should we be sharing more about the principles that we have put in place to be able to achieve that, which is something that people can then take and transpose elsewhere in terms of the approach. So the technical solution is not transposable, but the principles behind the technical approach behind the technical solution is the one that is transposable elsewhere. And therefore the question is, with all these different initiatives that are now moving from one country to the other, is there evidence that we are learning and we're becoming sort of smarter and more efficient, or let's say not even efficient, more effective in terms of the implementation? Or are we finding that we're coming across new situations each time that is requiring us to readapt continuously? And but surely at some stage we should be able to learn from that. Okay, great. I see there were 3 hands that came up. I thought I saw Ronald first, and was it you? This Ronald, or was it another Ronald? Yeah. Okay, go ahead, Ronald, and then we'll go to Venki.
I think
there was another Ronald in the room as well.
One of the interesting things that I've observed is that a lot of these initiatives, a lot of how this knowledge is created is really individual based. So I saw the Uganda EUDR data warehouse being set up from the beginning. And I can say that if there weren't a few individuals in some of the coffee exporting companies, maybe EUDR would be like right now at 600,000 smallholder farmers instead of like over 1 million. So when it comes to how this knowledge is, developed, a lot of it indeed is like a lot of personal initiative taken by these companies. But the other point I observe is that a lot of what we think, so for example, with NAgDI, what I hear from the private sector is that it's only the beginning. I remember one of my challenges, say, documenting this knowledge is that I was very excited that there is a collective of private sector partners trying to get this to work. But they told me, look, Ronald, this data warehouse is not exciting for us because all it says is that we have a basis to tag a bag of coffee to a farmer. But that doesn't guarantee that the farmer is going to sell to me. So a lot of the private sector thinking is beyond the data itself. So a lot of the private sector, immediately the EUDR data warehouse was set up, is that companies were starting to create incentives for farmers to sell to them. They were saying, okay, so I'm going to add on an incentive for the farmer. If you sell to me this bag of coffee, maybe you will get health insurance. Maybe you will get premium prices. So what I noticed was that the dialogue amongst donors and government and generally the goodwill of a data infrastructure is disconnected from what the private sector is thinking, because they are just saying, will I be able to buy $1 million of coffee? And I don't care anymore that I can now comply with EU regulation. What I really care about is, can I take some of the market share from Sukafina or from Yugacof or from XYZ? So I think that's one of the challenges that I observe around the disconnect of how the data is documented. And lastly, tied to that is that you find currently a lot of the data collection is being handled privately by individual private sector actors. And some of them, the story they're telling is not yet understood by the donors. So for example, some of the private sector was saying, look, we don't need a grant right now. What we need is a loan to be able to collect the data, because once we collect the data, there's so many companies willing to pay for it, because then they need to comply with EUDR and CS3D. So I think what to your question, Christian, what I feel is missing is that the voices in the room are not diverse enough. So we are not hearing a lot of these interesting alternative ideas, but also this is a very individual-driven initiative in different countries, whether it's Ghana or Uganda. And then lastly, that the people who are actually doing this work are moving to step B. They are too busy to start documenting. And when I was trying to say, let's document this case study, they were like, Ronald, if you're talking about EUDR, you're in the past. Right now, we are thinking about how to commercialize and keep our lights on as a private sector company, and you're talking about documenting, you're a bit in the past, we're moving forward. So I think that's maybe what I've had in the market. Yeah.
Great. No, thanks for sharing that. Venki, put on your systems thinking hat and let's have some of your thoughts.
No, I think, see, it's very difficult to, we really get to talk in abstraction terms if we go into a too much higher level, right? Each of the conditions, each of the complexity in each of the states is very different. Countries are different, the cultural nuances are very different. So what I can tell from experience that we went through in what we were attempting in UKI was that for us, data interoperability was not a bigger problem. We thought that was a very big problem, but fundamentally, data sovereignty. My current learning from where I am right now is that data sovereignty is a much bigger problem, and it's a completely underappreciated problem. I don't think we are paying as much attention to it. I don't even recollect anyone talking about data sovereignty in all this 1.5 hours that we started talking about it. Right? What is data sovereignty? Data sovereignty is we give the sense of comfort to a farmer saying that this data belongs to him and he can monetize it whatever he wants. Right? Today, none of the structures that we have in DPI can give that sense of assurance and comfort to farmers. Right? We build the structures, we build the frameworks for it. Right? But if a framework cannot translate to a sense of assurance to a farmer that it's giving him that sense of sovereignty, then we clearly haven't done, we haven't walked the long mile. So that's point one. Second is in all the DPI networks, I think there is also a lot of sort of paternalistic understanding that we are here to give technology to farmers who don't have the means to collaborate. I think that's a very, in the age of WhatsApp and YouTube, that's a very false assumption that we may have to want to, revisit that. Right? They are not waiting for us to give the tools for them to come and collaborate. They have already figured ways to collaborate. What we are coming together is ways to bring the various stakeholders in a way that sort of mimics how the existing structures have already emerged. So if one wants to really look at how does one actually build, the key thing is to really go and understand what are the kinds of collaborations that are happening in an informal way, right? Like one of the things that I've been very fascinated and, especially in the context of India is there's always a formal agricultural ecosystem and there's an informal agricultural ecosystem. We only pay attention to the formal and we only imagine a very simplistic idea of structures. Whereas what is happening in the informal is way more complex. And unless until we go down to the aspect of understanding what are the ways in which the informal ecosystems are operating, we will probably never be able to create that space for ecosystem. I'll stop here. Happy to address any questions further.
Okay, I've got another Ronald who would like to speak. Go ahead. This is Ronald from Malawi. You need to unmute.
India, are you able to allow him?
He can certainly unmute himself. I can't unmute. I can only provide him access.
So you gave him access. Ronald, can you unmute yourself? Ronald from Malawi. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, we'll have to close very soon, but let me just also share. Am I sharing? No, I'm not sharing. Just to share with people that as we are getting to the close, I don't know whether you can see this. The slide?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so just to show that, well, what we've done is we created a community of practice, online community of practice to be able to discuss the kind of issues we've been talking about so far. We have people with solutions, we have people with problems, challenges, we have people with principles of operation or design of the systems that want to share. And we are hoping that through the establishment of this community of practice, we'll be able to bring more conversations on this topic, similar to what we've done, both during webinars and through these e-conversations that we've been organizing. So the question now is, how do we move forward? Because we are coming to the end of a month-long intervention. The policy guide is out. We're hoping people can study the way the guide is structured, looking at the bits and pieces, as I think Stuart said, providing a frame in bits and pieces or in modular approach in terms of the kinds of considerations that need to go towards implementation of NAgDI, but also then being able to, on each one of these little modules, look at what has been the experience elsewhere, what are the good practices or promising practices, what are the good practices that we need to adopt. Just like we talk of adopting standards, we can talk of these practices that we try out, and with time they become good practices in terms of implementation of NAgDI, but building on the DPI approach that is still very much ongoing everywhere else. Eventually, then it's also about how do we now get people to make use of these DPIs and the NAgDI infrastructure that we are putting into place. So, okay, if you've got those of you who are not members of the community of practice, you can scan this code, or you can use the URL to get into it. I'll just stop sharing, and maybe we'll go back to back to the floor with maybe a quick final words before I hand over to Ben to close the whole month-long activity. But Bharat, you've been listening intently, but you haven't said anything. Maybe just a few thoughts that come to mind. What should we do next in terms of moving forward with this approach of NAgDI from your perspective at FIDE? And I'll ask Stuart about what do we do with Open AgriNet, for example. Should the Open AgriNet community and NAgDI community talk to each other? We haven't had much interaction from OAN in our discussions, and so go ahead. Maybe in 30 seconds each.
Yeah.
A few things that come to your mind.
Yeah, sure, Christian. But I think Venki and Stuart hit on that point a bit, right? You really need a place where offtake can happen. Pilots don't really get you that far. You want to have an experimental iterative process, true, but then you also want to make sure that it sustains in a way that it continues. There's an institution, there's an organization set up that can continue the work that you begin. That's, I think, primary. The second piece is, if you want to do that, then what is the use case that you're going to start with? It has to be a winning use case. It has to be something that can reach a huge scale, because there's no point in just scaling what works in a small location. The diversity will kill it. You need to figure out what works at scale, and then you design for that scale, and then you start small and then expand later. But the design still holds good, right? I think those are the only two learnings for us from everything that we've done at FIDE. We were involved with Stuart and the whole implementation with OAN as well. We're also involved with the thing that Google announced a couple of weeks ago with the World Bank, and they're trying to take this open networks approach to about 25 countries. So it seems to be something that is capturing the interest of a lot of big players, a lot of interest in also the governments who are looking at it. So who knows? I think NAgDI could be one of the conveners and one of the people who are actually taking it to market and seeing what comes out of it.
So what I heard was a pilot that can be easily replicable or transposable elsewhere, and also a use case or an area where we can scale to demonstrate the value of it.
Absolutely.
Who would like to go next? Between the people on the screen, I can see now. Ronald, any quick thoughts, 2 or 3 key ideas of what we should be doing next?
I think like Stuart said, the farmer profiling fatigue is incredibly too much. Like everybody's going to the same guy collecting the same data, and sometimes it's the same person going back because they collected data for EUDR and they are going back for EUFL, forced labor. Now they need to find out if there are children on the farm. Then they are going back for CS3D. It's terrible. But then the other point is the farmer not having ownership of this data is a tipping issue going to become a big issue, because some farmer groups, for example, a cooperative called Ndugu, decided, look, we are not interested in any systems. We are going to collect our own data because one coffee company collected the data and we cannot access it to sell to another coffee company, and they are locked into so they are locked in their inability to have their own data So I think those two issues, the farmer profiling fatigue and the issue of lack of sovereignty, farmers not being able to access their own data, even with national systems, is really a tipping issue. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so I heard the self-sovereign data or management, self-sovereign identity. Then also this aspect of, this principle of ask once and use many times, which a lot of governments are trying to do, but we need to devise what is the ask once and use many times in the agricultural sector, so that we should be smart enough to be able to formulate or start formulating what this potentially could be, and then allow the farmers to adopt it for themselves. So they devise it for themselves. So whoever comes in, well, there you go. This is the information. If I give my consent, then you can have access to it. But obviously, all the conditions should be satisfied. I'll move to Venki, then I'll move to Stuart, and then finish with Ben. Venki, any final words?
No, I think there's a lot of talk and going on, and right now it's a flavor du jour, DPIs. So I think it's important for us to really get down to what's happening in there, and we some of us are attempting to take some of these learnings and try out the next version of what could be a reasonable way to really tackle this problem of bringing ecosystems together. So yeah, work is on.
Great. Yeah. Okay. So I again heard ecosystems. DPI is the flavor of the month. I also just remember what Stuart said, the DPI summit happening next week or the week after. It's good to see the evolution of what is happening in these DPI summits as we go from year to year, including the one we have in Africa, which is the ID for Africa, which was held recently, where we had a lot of these presentations on DPI. So which goes back to the challenges we're still having with registries before we move to the other the other uses and features. Stuart?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I mean, it's sort of early days in a way for us figuring this out, and so I think these forums where we can share knowledge, share what's working, how different countries are approaching this. I think the use cases we've heard about today, like EUDR, fertilizer subsidies, contract integrity, credit scoring, it's important, I think, to over time abstract up and what are the common requirements, common specifications, common architectures that can serve many of these use cases. And there's different people trying different things here. So AgriStack in India, they've sort of built out their approach to this across many states. So, okay, maybe that's something that could be reused. Google, as you just mentioned, Venki, is, the open networks approach. It's up to countries should have choices. If they want to go with a Google Cloud solution that's sort of like a DPI in a box type solution, that's their choice. If they want to go with an open source solution, they're hosting themselves, then they should have that option. Last week I saw Safaricom had built a solution in Kenya on the health side. They build it, it's open source, they host it for the government, maybe that's an approach. But I think right now, just sharing these different approaches, Open AgriNet is just one approach. It's really focused on the AI advisory side. It's not really a marketplace, but it's more the sort of protocols that you introduce to a nation or a state that already has a lot of disparate data for AI advisory services, not for sort of tackling all the farmer data. But I think, these implications of AI should really be something we should be looking at a lot. Because AI is not just, in my case, farmer facing, it's also a way to pull together lots of unstructured data, data that's, farmers are actually, as you said, already using WhatsApp. They're using these chatbots, all the data that's going to be generated through that, what's the policy around that data? How is AI going to change this, the sort of landscape of data sharing and data sovereignty, which was mentioned too, and what are the policies and regulations that we should be thinking about to ensure that people aren't disenfranchised from the value capture of that data. So to be continued.
Yeah, right. Yeah, thanks, Stuart.
Yeah.
So what I heard is the freedom of choice of platforms or approaches, but maybe with the principle of ensuring that you remain interoperable with others so you can link up again. The aspect of keeping the conversations going, and maybe defining what are the data that we think we need to be able to train these AI features. Again, it goes back to AI will not figure out what to do by itself, but we have to know what is it that we want to feed the AI with as training data to be able to give us the output that we want. I'm not sure whether we've done a good job on that in terms of even designing our own DPI and systems so far. I don't know whether, Ben, before I go to you, I don't know whether Ronald Udedi is able to unmute and talk to us or not. No, I think it's not. Yeah, he's able to unmute. There's no. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Okay.
pity we cannot hear someone from the audience, but anyway, over to you, Ben. It's been a good journey.
Yeah. Yeah. No, thank you. Congratulations to Christian. Christian has been leading all this, so good job. Yeah, no, I think we have, yeah, Stewart said to be continued. Yeah, we will continue the conversation. And, but again, from Ronald to Venki, I mean, on the registries, on sovereignty, that is what NAgDI is about. Again, NAgDI doesn't, it's not prescribing any one technology. Our value addition is the process around the technology. So we are ready to work with any technology. And once we get to the country, we will discover all these challenges. And again, we are talking about data sovereignty from country level. So first, make sure that the country has control over their data down all the way to the farmers. Because if the government can have that control, I'm not saying, yeah, that's not the right term, control, but can have that third eye over how data is being exchanged, then you can now empower the individual data holder to be able to have a voice. But if you, as a country, you are not in charge of what is happening, then you struggle to empower the individuals to be able to monetize their data and get value. So it's the same angle. So yeah, and then when it comes to the registries, basically what we are saying is once the foundational ID is built, government doesn't, if you don't have it already, you don't need to go and start building a new farmer registry, because there are a lot of private entities that have bits and pieces of this registry. So data exchange can help you harmonize these existing registries, and then they will just keep updating it, and everybody can, with support of the technology, consent, secure data system, you can allow. So we talk about open standards, not open data, open standard, and protocols to be applied. You the tech people will understand that more. So basically, that is the language around NAgDI. Look, we go with any technology, but we will support you with the policies, the governance, and the incentives for the data exchange to take place. So once again, thank you for all the discussions, the e-conversations, the webinars, and we look forward to the practical cases as we go to the countries. We want champions, who want to be part of this, and we want individuals and organizations who have the resources to jump on board and say, look, we want to, for the next 5 years, we want to support this process in this country. You don't expect all the results within 1 year. The 5-year strategy that we have shows that by the first year, you should be able to be looking at these indicators. Second year, third year, by the fourth year, you should be able to be getting to a functional NAgDI in the country, with the technologies working, with the farmers being able to have control over their data and be able to have the incentives to release and all kinds of things. So yeah, so I'll stop there and say once again, thank you to those who are still in the audience. And next month or so, we will we'll try to see if we can organize a public debate on the policy guide. Now that the policy guide is out, we will open it up for people to come and give us critique so that we can improve upon it. So we will get back to all of you, maybe through the community and through the registration list that we have, to see, to have a public debate on the policy guide that we have launched yesterday. Thank you.
Great. Thank you to all, and to the participants, to our presenters and our panelists today. And yeah, I wonder what I'll be doing next Friday this time. It became a routine. Yeah. But yeah, talk of coherence and consistency. My wife reminded me that I've been wearing the same shirt every Friday afternoon.
Oh no!
So it makes it easier to edit the pictures and the videos from week to week.
The recording, I'll go back and look at the recordings and see. That's
All right.
Thank you. Thank you all. Yeah.
Thanks again.
All right.
everyone.
Thank you. Nice to
Thanks,
see you, Stuart. It's been a while.
Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.